The morning sun had barely climbed over the ridge when Sarah Whitfield stepped out onto her porch and felt the color drain from her face. Her tomato plants, the ones she had nursed since April, staked and tied and watered by hand every evening after a full day of work, lay flattened across the garden bed like they had been trampled by a stampede. Muddy paw prints tracked through what remained of her bean rows, and half her cabbage heads had been dug up and scattered, their pale roots exposed to the morning air. She did not need to look far to find the culprit. Bo, the enormous brown and black mixed-breed dog belonging to her neighbor Caleb Reed, sat happily in the middle of the wreckage, tongue lolling out, entirely unrepentant, as though he had done nothing more than take a pleasant stroll. Sarah pressed her palm to her forehead and let out a long breath that was somewhere between a groan and a sob. This was the third time in 2 months. The garden was not a hobby to her. It was survival. Since her husband Thomas had died in the accident at the sawmill 18 months ago, the small plot behind her house had become the difference between a table with food on it and a table without. She had 2 children to feed, 7-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Jonah, and a garden that failed meant winter would be harder than it already promised to be. She was still learning how to be both mother and father, how to chop wood and mend fences and keep a roof from leaking, and every ounce of control she could claim over her circumstances mattered to her in ways she doubted anyone else could understand. She marched across the field toward the fence line that separated her land from Caleb's, her boots slapping hard against the dirt, her apron still tied loosely from where she'd been kneading bread before she'd noticed the disaster. Caleb was already outside, having apparently heard the commotion, standing near his barn in his shirt sleeves with his hat pushed back on his head. When he saw her coming, something in his expression shifted, part apology and part weary resignation, as though he already knew exactly what this conversation was going to be. "How much this time?" he asked, before she'd even reached the fence, his voice carrying that particular blend of guilt and dry humor that always seemed to infuriate her more than comfort her. "You think this is funny?" Sarah snapped, stopping at the rail, her hands finding her hips in the same posture she'd taken the last 2 times this had happened. "Your dog destroyed half my garden, Caleb. The tomatoes are ruined. The cabbages are ruined. Do you have any idea what that means for me right now?" Caleb's jaw tightened, and he glanced down at Bo, who had ambled over to sit at his feet, still looking entirely pleased with himself. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I truly am. I thought I had him tied up last night. He must have chewed through the rope again." "You thought," she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut. "That's what you said the last time. And the time before that. I can't keep replanting because your dog doesn't understand what a fence is for." He crossed the distance between them and rested his forearms on the top rail of the fence, and for a moment his eyes softened in a way that made her want to look away. "I'll fix the fence today," he said. "I'll dig it in deeper this time, put up something he can't get through. And I'll replace what he ruined. Whatever the garden needs, I'll cover it. Seedlings, whatever you have to buy in town, I'm paying for it." Sarah crossed her arms, unwilling to let her anger deflate so easily, even though something in her chest had already begun to soften despite her best efforts. "That garden was supposed to feed my children through the winter, Caleb. It's not just tomatoes and cabbage. It's flour money and boot money and coal money. It's everything." "I know," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he said it, low and sincere, that made her believe he understood more than he was letting on. "I'll help you replant. Today, if you'll let me. I'm not going to just throw money at it and walk away." She wanted to refuse him. Pride told her to refuse him, to say she could manage on her own, the way she had told herself every single day since Thomas died that she could manage on her own. But the truth was the garden needed to go back into the ground quickly if it was going to have any chance of producing before the first frost, and pride did not put food on a table. So she gave a short, stiff nod, and told him she would meet him at the garden within the hour, and turned on her heel and walked back toward the house without another word, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way. By mid-morning, Caleb had arrived with a wagon full of new seedlings from town, more than she likely needed, along with fence posts and a coil of sturdy wire. He worked without complaint through the heat of the day, digging new post holes along her garden's perimeter while she and the children replanted what could be salvaged and set new starts where the old ones had been crushed beyond saving. Emma trailed after Caleb with wide, curious eyes, asking him 100 questions about the dog and the farm and whether Bo had ever herded cattle, and Jonah, who rarely warmed to strangers so quickly since his father's passing, found himself laughing every time Bo bounded past with his tongue hanging out, chasing a stick Caleb had thrown for him well clear of the garden this time. Sarah watched her children from the corner of her eye as she pressed seedlings into the soil, and something in her chest ached in a way she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. It had been so long since she had heard Jonah laugh like that. So long since Emma had looked at a man with anything other than the cautious wariness she developed after losing her father. She told herself it meant nothing, that Caleb was simply making amends for his dog's misbehavior, that she should not read anything more into an afternoon of shared labor. But when Caleb knelt down beside her to help tie the tomato stakes, his sleeves rolled up and dirt on his forearms, and he glanced over at her with an easy, unguarded smile, she felt something stir in her that she had thought had died along with Thomas. They worked until the sun began its long slide toward the western hills, and by the time the last row was planted, the garden looked almost as good as it had before the disaster. Better in some places, since Caleb had insisted on adding a section of squash that Sarah hadn't had the seed for on her own. He stood back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and surveyed the work with something like satisfaction. "It'll take a few weeks before you know for certain," he said, "but I think we caught it in time. Should still have a good harvest before frost." "Thank you," Sarah said, and the words came out softer than she intended, softer than the anger that had carried her across the field that morning. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did," he said simply. "Bo's my responsibility. What he does is on me. And besides—" He hesitated, glancing toward Emma and Jonah, who were now sprawled in the grass with Bo between them, the dog's tail thumping contentedly against the ground. "I like coming over here. I haven't said that plainly before, but I figure I ought to." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, and she busied herself brushing dirt from her skirt to avoid meeting his eyes. She knew what people in town whispered about the widow Whitfield and the bachelor Reed whose land bordered hers, knew the sideways glances she'd gotten at church when Caleb had carried her firewood in after last month's storm, knew that whispers in a small settlement like theirs could turn into something either beautiful or ruinous depending on how carefully two people conducted themselves. But standing there in the golden light with her children's laughter drifting across the field and Caleb's earnest gaze fixed on her, she found she cared less about the whispers than she had at any point since Thomas's death. "I like it too," she admitted finally, the words costing her more courage than she expected them to. "Even when your dog is destroying my garden." Caleb laughed, a real laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and something about the sound of it settled into her chest like warmth after a long cold winter. "I promise you, the new fence will hold. Though I can't promise Bo won't find some other way to make a nuisance of himself. He's got a talent for it." "As long as it isn't my garden," she said, though there was no real edge to it anymore. Over the following weeks, Caleb found reasons to come by, some legitimate, checking on the fence, bringing over milk from his cow when hers had gone dry, helping Jonah build a small wooden cart he'd been begging his mother for since spring, and some transparent enough that even Emma, at 7 years old, began to giggle every time she spotted him crossing the field. Sarah found herself looking forward to the sight of him more than she was willing to admit, even to herself, and she caught herself smiling at odd moments during the day, thinking of something he'd said, or the way Jonah had started imitating his low, easy laugh. But it was not without its complications. Sarah's Aunt Louisa, who had been the closest thing to a mother she had since her own parents passed, came to visit one Sunday afternoon and did not hold back her opinions on the matter. "You're barely past morning, Sarah," she said, seated stiffly at the kitchen table while Sarah kneaded dough for the week's bread. "People will talk. A man's dog trampling your garden is one thing. A man himself trampling all over your good sense is another." "He's been kind to us, Aunt Louisa," Sarah said, keeping her voice level though the words stung more than she expected. "He's been kind to the children. Jonah hasn't laughed like that in over a year." "Kindness and courtship are different things, child, and you know it," Louisa said. "You have to think of what's best for those babies, not just what feels good in the moment." The words lodged themselves under Sarah's skin and stayed there for days afterward, a splinter she could not quite work free. She began to second-guess the warmth she felt whenever Caleb's wagon appeared on the road, wondering if she was betraying Thomas's memory, wondering if she was setting her children up for another loss should things not work out, wondering if the town's whispers carried more truth in their judgment than she wanted to admit. She grew distant for a time, offering polite but brief greetings when Caleb came by, declining his help with tasks she once would have gladly accepted. And though he did not press her, she could see the confusion and quiet hurt in his eyes each time she turned him away. It was Emma, in her innocent and unguarded way, who finally broke through the wall Sarah had built. One evening, as Sarah tucked her into bed, Emma looked up with a solemn honesty only children seem to possess and asked, "Why doesn't Mr. Caleb come around anymore? Did Bo do something bad again?" "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, smoothing the blanket over her daughter's shoulders. "Nothing like that." "Then why?" Emma pressed. "I like it when he's here. Jonah likes it too. It feels less quiet. Papa's gone, but it doesn't feel so empty when Mr. Caleb's around." The word struck Sarah with a force she hadn't anticipated, and she sat in silence for a long moment after Emma drifted off to sleep, turning them over in her mind. It doesn't feel so empty. She thought of the year and a half of silence that had settled over their little house since Thomas's death. The ache of every meal eaten without his laughter at the table, the weight of every decision she now had to carry alone. She thought of how that weight had felt lighter, somehow, on the afternoons Caleb had spent in her garden. How her children's grief had softened into something more like ordinary childhood joy whenever he was near. She realized, sitting there in the quiet of her daughter's room, that she had been so afraid of losing something again that she had nearly thrown away something good before it had even fully begun. The next morning, she walked across the field to Caleb's homestead before she could talk herself out of it, her heart hammering the whole way. He was in the yard mending a section of harness, and when he looked up and saw her approaching, he set the leather down slowly, his expression cautious, as though bracing for whatever she had come to say. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said, before her courage could fail her. "I pulled away from you these past weeks, and it wasn't fair. I was scared, Caleb. Scared of caring about someone again, and scared of what people would say, and scared of getting it wrong for my children's sake. But I was wrong to let that fear push you away." Caleb crossed the yard slowly, Bo trotting at his heels, and stopped just a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the hope flickering behind the caution in his eyes. "I understand being scared," he said. "I've been scared too, Sarah, since the day I realized how much I looked forward to seeing you and your children every single day. I lost my own family young, you know that. I never thought I'd want this again. A home full of noise and mess and someone waiting for me at the end of the day. But I do want it. I want it with you, if you'll have me." Sarah felt tears rise unbidden, not from sorrow this time but from something fuller, something that felt like the first real warmth she had let herself feel in over a year. "The children already think of you as part of our lives," she said. "Emma told me last night the house doesn't feel so empty when you're there. I think I've been feeling the same way, and I was just too afraid to say it." Caleb reached out and took her hand, his fingers rough and calloused from years of honest labor, and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles that made her breath catch in her throat. "Then let me be part of it properly," he said. "Let me court you the way you deserve, out in the open. No more sneaking around or pretending it's just about the dog and the fence. Let this town talk all it wants. I don't care, as long as it's you and me and those two children at the end of every day." She laughed then, a watery, joyful sound, and nodded, unable to find words equal to the fullness in her chest. Word did spread through the settlement in the weeks that followed, as word always does in small places, but the whispers softened into something gentler than gossip when folks saw how the widow Whitfield's children had bloomed under Caleb Reed's steady presence, how Jonah had taken to following him around the property like a shadow, how Emma had taken to calling him nothing but Mr. Caleb with an affection too plain to mistake for anything but love. Even Aunt Louisa, upon seeing the change in the children and the quiet steadiness in Sarah's eyes, softened her stance, admitting one evening over supper that perhaps she had judged too quickly, that perhaps some things were meant to grow back stronger after being trampled, much like a garden replanted with care. By the time autumn arrived and the garden Caleb had helped rebuild bore its first real harvest, heavy tomatoes and full cabbage heads and squash enough to see them comfortably through winter, Caleb had already asked Sarah to marry him beneath the very fence line where Bo had first torn through her garden, down on one knee in the golden evening light with Emma and Jonah standing beside him grinning from ear to ear, clearly having been let in on the secret beforehand. Sarah said yes before he had even finished the question, laughing through happy tears as her children threw their arms around both of them at once, and even Bo seemed to sense the occasion, barking joyfully and running circles around the small, newly whole family standing together at the fence line that no longer divided two properties but joined them. They married the following spring in a small ceremony at the homestead, the garden in full bloom around them, and when Sarah looked out over the neat rows of vegetables that had once lain trampled and ruined, she thought of how something broken and destroyed had become, through patience and unexpected kindness, the very ground on which she had rebuilt her family's happiness. Caleb built a new, sturdier fence that year, not to keep anyone apart, but simply because a good fence, like a good marriage, was worth maintaining with care, and Bo, forever unrepentant and forever beloved, spent the rest of his days sleeping contentedly between the two properties that had long since become one home, one family, and one life neither Sarah nor Caleb had ever expected to find again, yet had, in the end, found exactly when they needed it most.